Welcome to the book launch of Professor Ellen Helsper's book, Disconnects. I'm Professor Cammaerts. You'll see, and I will be chairing the session. So it is with great joy to welcome you all to this public event, which has been a long time coming. I welcome those who are following online, but also especially those who are here in person. It's so nice to see so many people in one room. Finally, I would say. Now, almost 20 years ago, I co-edited a book that was entitled Beyond the Digital Divide. And the main argument of that book was that inequalities in terms of access to the internet infrastructures, as well as digital skills, are intersectionally intertwined with more structural inequalities. At that time, the internet was very much seen as this silver bullet solution, but it was and is a fallacy to think that bridging the digital divide would magically solve all other divides and exclusions in terms of education, employment, mobility, poverty, etc. We argued back then that policymakers should reverse that argument so that connection would become an outcome of policies tackling social exclusion more broadly rather than the other way around. In many ways, Professor Helsper's book bangs on that same nail, but she does so much more sophisticated data than we had back then to back this up. And of course, many issues and challenges today are quite different than they were 20 years ago. For many of us, disconnection is unfathomable, except that in the context of going off-grid on a digital detox. However, this connection is still very real for many people, and as Ellen will outline, it manifests itself in many complex ways. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Helsper, who will give a brief overview of our book, after which we will have three respondents, Marta, Arretche, Professor of Political Science at the University of Sao Paulo, Karen Mossberger, Frank and June Sackton, Professor at Arizona State University, and our own Mike Savage, a Professor of Sociology here at the LSE. And so after their short interventions, we will also open the floor to questions from the audience here. And I will also at that time be monitoring the Q&A session on Zoom and field questions to the panel, selected questions to the panel. So thank you for all being here. Ellen, please.
Thank you so much, Bart. Yeah, well, Bart has kind of already said it all, so I would say read the book and then I can talk. No, so yeah, I just also wanted to say thank you, because while I have written the words or put the words on paper, and now also virtual paper and now physical paper, the book is really kind of the result of much collaborative work, both with my research colleagues from around the world on the digital skills tangible outcomes projects, the continuation of those projects that have been running for many years, such as the Global Kids Online projects, now the Youth Skills projects, where we've looked at this. My colleagues from projects that are right now running and where we are analyzing data, for example, from the Kuwait project, where we will be launching the report in 2 weeks' time. So you can also come to that one if you want to know something more specific about Kuwait. The Spanish data that we're currently crunching. And I wanted to say thank you to my colleagues from the LSE, obviously, who are in this room. Bart has been fundamental in getting this book into being with our book club that we had, but I also recognize some faces of other people who've been there to support me, both within the Media Communications Department, but also at the IAI. And I know that virtually present with me here are those colleagues from Latin America, from Kuwait, from South Africa, who have worked so hard on to generate all this sophisticated data, let's call it, from around the world, so that I would be able to write this book, building on the work of many others, people like Bart and Cammaerts, but also the people that will be commenting. The other people that have been fundamental in making this book happen are, of course, the participants in the research. This book is not about what I think about what digital technologies or digitization does to people from various backgrounds, from various regions around the world, but it really tries to kind of illustrate what that experience is like from the bottom up, from the ground up. And, in the International Inequalities Institute, with the theme of the politics of inequality, the politics of inequality in particular, we've really tried to give voices to those everyday experiences of disadvantage and inequality, and those come out in the book as well. And then a personal note of thank, obviously, to all my friends and my family, some of which are actually also in the room, virtually or physically, because without them, I wouldn't have been here, but the book also definitely wouldn't have been here. And so that is a long, kind of winded way of saying thank you to all of this. But it is really important because, as Bart has already indicated, what I do in the book is really examine the social causes and consequences of inequalities in increasingly digital societies. And that has to build on the kind of things that we already know about how inequalities have existed, which inequalities have existed, what the causes have been of historical inequalities, because the digital doesn't come into an empty space, right? It comes into historical processes where systems are in place that have generated certain forms of inequality. So the book really starts with that. It discusses the lessons learned. It builds on this kind of idea of the corresponding fields framework, where maybe some of the commenters will look at as well, but where I look at the correspondence between inequalities that have historically existed, such as economic inequalities, inequalities in levels of education or skills, human capital, and inequalities in power and participation in society. These are the kind of fundamental things that have been studied. Both have long histories in the historical study of inequalities, but also in relation to the digital space. Who can participate, who has access, who can access kind of, economically advantageous types of content or educational content, who knows how to navigate that content and that world in ways that bring these positive results. What the book also tries to do is look at some more of the kind of the newer frontiers of inequalities. Not that they haven't been studied, but they have been less studied within that digital space. So when we come to these new frontiers of inequalities in loneliness and connection, or in the creation of content and consumption at an everyday level, so we're not talking about programming here, but what we often hear is this kind of idea that universally people use it, or that the effects of digitization in those spaces are exactly the same. And one of the things that the book tries to do is to point out that actually there are very considerable inequalities in those things that really determine our well-being and a more full participation in society that goes beyond that kind of more economic instrumental aspect of how we might participate. And yeah, one of the calls that I make in the book is for more research to take place on that was really our everyday lives. And one of the important things of the book is, and I call myself a realist optimist in the book, I say, like, I think there is lots of potential for technology or digital societies to create a more equal, a better world for everybody, where everybody can participate on equal terms. But the reality of it is that the ways in which a lot of policies and programs are implemented right now are kind of not doing that and are causing an amplification of some of these processes that we've seen historically. And so what I also offer in the book at the end is kind of, practical policy solutions, or the kind of ways in which we can design interventions or think about research that will contribute to changing these patterns that we have seen in the ways that policy has been implemented in the world. So for the details, as I said, read the book, because I don't have enough time. I promised to do a brief presentation, and I've already spent too much time on the introduction. So what I will do is, because the book is words, right? And the amazing thing about the digital technology is that we can actually have interactive content and visual content. So I won't be presenting a lot of words in the rest of this talk. Actually, the first slide has quite a bit of and the last one. But I will mainly be kind of illustrating some of the things that I talk about in the book through the visuals, through the graphs that I use, through quotes from the people that have participated. And I think, well, to start that, basically, it is necessary to kind of give a big brief for those of you who haven't read the book or haven't really been exposed to kind of the details of my work. This is the kind of terminology that I use. So I don't talk about digital inequalities. I don't talk about divides, but I talk about inequalities, and I talk about social digital inequalities in particular to refer to these systematic differences in the opportunity and the ability to use ICTs, or information communication technologies, or deciding not to use them, or the ability to disengage from the digital world when that does not lead to these beneficial outcomes that we're interested in, right? So for me, it's not about the digital world. It's not about people being able to participate digitally or have access to digital technologies, but it's really about using those technologies to improve your life and to avoid these kind of more negative outcomes. Not just now, not just in can I use the platforms and the technologies or live in that digital world where we're living in now, but also in a future that might look quite differently. And the book also ends with a note on that the digital future might actually be quite different from the one that we're living in right now. Important here is to emphasize that I look at systematic inequalities. So I don't look at if somebody's in or out, right? If an individual is using technologies or not using technologies, but whether there is systematic differences based on people's backgrounds or the regions where they come from in terms of how they are able to and what opportunities they have to engage in these positive ways in that digital world. So just briefly to kind of put the picture, paint the picture of the book, it is based, as I said, on the work of many other people who have done work before me on this theme. I'm definitely not the first person. But if we think about the world as existing of the advantaged and the disadvantaged, right? There is a potential future scenarios that people have suggested that might happen with digitization. And this is the kind of, the optimistic leapfrogging scenario where people who have not had access to certain resources, who've never been able to get an education of a certain kind, who don't have access to banking, for example, who have not had access to other resources such as connecting to people because they are isolated, that technologies will give them the opportunity. And because they've been deprived and because it's much more important for them perhaps than for people who have already lived in quite advantaged situations, that they will be able to leapfrog and actually, get even better lives than the advantage. So that's the nice rosy scenario that, you might hope for. The reality is that we are really looking at this kind of amplification pattern, is that if technologies just get introduced in most circumstances, although I do describe situations in which this is not the case in the book, that not only is there a stratification in the sense of that when people get access to these technologies, like that people kind of, the advantage and the disadvantage are taking it up in the same way so that these existing inequalities keep existing in the same way. But we actually see that the people who have an advantage are able to take up these new technologies and inventions to far greater extent than those who are disadvantaged, and that we see an increase of inequalities. And this has to do partly with the digital side, but as I talk about in the book, it has a lot to do with how and in which ways these technologies are introduced. And that builds a lot on historical theories of inequality in terms of the paradigms that are used for this. So what I do in the book is, as I said, I start with this kind of sketching of the landscape in which people's offline resources, historically, economic, social, cultural, personal resources, these kinds of well-being elements have been historically kind of unequally distributed. And then I kind of talk about, and this is not my invention, this is something that has arisen over the work of many other people in the field, that we see a development, and the book is organized along these chapters where we see kind of these different levels of digital inequalities that we can talk about that are based on these offline economic and social and cultural inequalities that already existed. So inequalities in access, and then we're talking, that's the kind of first level. And then we're not talking just about whether somebody has access or not, but the quality of that access and what they can, the opportunities that that access offers, also the context in which they use it. If you live in a society that's completely based on everybody just having a mobile phone is a great resource, because everything society services are designed around having a mobile phone. If you live in a society where most things are done on larger screens with more capacity, then having just a mobile phone actually puts you at a disadvantage and might exclude you further. So we can think of people who have access to only a mobile phone in a country where you have to submit your homework and write essays, where essay writing is a really important part of education, for example. That is extremely hard to do on a mobile phone. So even though you have access, it's not high quality access. It's not access. It's not your own phone that you can use autonomously or wherever you are. Yeah. And the second level of this is this kind of level of that even with access, if you are not able to use it, if you don't know how to use it, either in a technical kind of functional way, or if you don't understand how the technology is constructed and what the impact might be of certain designs or certain types of ways of using the technology on your and others' lives, then actually the access is also relatively useless. And we see that even when people have similar levels of access, these differences, these inequalities in historical resources still sketch out differences, both in terms of the skills that people have, but also in terms of the kinds of content they engage with. And here's where the corresponding fields model comes in, is that we see those people who have lots of economic resources, who have relative wealth or financial resources, but for example, don't have a lot of social connections and are socially isolated. When they acquire skills and when they acquire access, what they tend to do is they tend to reinforce those things that they already have. So they might invest, become wealthier, but they're unlikely to overcome that aspect that's loneliness. And the other way around. Some people might have lots of social resources or cultural resources, but few financial resources. They tend to, the theory goes, use their access and their skills to increase the resources that they already have. So the book works through those domains. What the book shows is that the explanations for inequality, especially when it comes to this third level, which is these kind of outcomes of the use of technology, or the outcomes of the digitization of our societies, that especially when it comes to that the explanations for inequalities in this become increasingly complex and less technological. Yeah. If there's a problem of access, the easiest thing is to give people access, and then you can debate about quality access. But if somebody has this, uses the same platform online and has the same levels of skills than as other people, but still has much more negative experiences, we can think of social media, where some people from certain backgrounds might actually have much more negative experience in terms of harassment or discrimination than others. We can see that the explanations there become increasingly complex and increasingly less technological. So this was quite a lot of theory visualized. So what I'm going to do now is just very quickly, with some graphs and some quotes, kind of give a kind of a little taste of what comes in the other chapters, where these things are worked through. And I'll try to do that very quickly. If you want more detail, obviously, you know, as I said before. Okay, so just very briefly, in economic and human capital inequality, so these are inequalities in skills and access, what we can see is that access keeps changing, yeah, that what you need to be fully connected keeps changing over time. And it also differs per region, yeah, at the world. What counts as a really good connection in one part of the world might not count as a very good connection in another part of the world, which means that we both see, if you just introduce access as a basis, that we can see that. And what we can see here in this graph, for example, is that while, I think you can't see that if you're in the room, actually, is that while the relationship between high quality connections like broadband and GDP has remained exactly the same, which means that actually one of the best predictors of GDP or of access, depending on which way the relationship goes, remains kind of wealth and quality access are still very strongly related. And these are differences between countries, while the correlation between people who have mobile phone access and the wealth of a country has become almost zero. So that means that actually introducing mobile phones, maybe if you want to think that the technology is the solution to overcoming wealth inequalities, that mobile phones are not the solution to overcome wealth inequalities around the world. And this is worrying because this is actually a policy that is implemented in many parts of the world. But the same counts for differences within countries, right? Where kind of, while providing access, kind of can overcome these kind of extrinsic barriers, like I don't have access, it's too expensive. You give people cheap access, yeah. that can overcome these extrinsic barriers, but that doesn't mean that these intrinsic barriers in terms of like thinking that you don't have the skills to use it or that it's something for other people, they remain in place and these access solutions are not sufficient. And here's a really disconnect between what policymakers interventions often do and what people say they need in everyday lives. There's a lot of emphasis on technical programming skills, but when you talk to people about what really complicates your life in terms of technology to live a full life where you can participate in society, is that it's other types of digital skills that are needed, right? And it's also a kind of where kind of traditional patterns of seeing some people as better at using technologies. And like Anna in this case, she actually had quite good skills in managing the technology, but she still saw the men in her life as being the ones to go to ask questions, and they would never come to her, right? She would ask her son, she would ask her boyfriend, to do these things. And actually, in what we see in our research, that obtain these positive outcomes, in, for example, in relation to education, this kind of self-confidence, or the actual skills to be able to navigate these technologies in a way that leads to these positive outcomes, that these kinds of more critical skills, these kind of more understanding of how technologies work, how information is presented, we can think about fake news and everything that's going on, are much more important to participate. That's some of these technical skills that we're teaching in many of the programs right now. And one of the things that's important here is that the sequences is very clear as well. This is cumulative. So the time to people from certain regions or backgrounds that have to have poor quality connections also tend to have fewer of these skills, both technical and other skills. So it's accumulation, right? It's the same people who also then have traditionally both economic and other kinds of disadvantage. The other area that I look at is this kind of more traditional area of civic participation. There's been a lot of optimism in the past, all kinds of revolutions that said that they had happened because of the digital technology. But in fact, what we see is that those people who are able to participate in the digital aspect of the revolutions are often people who already have a voice, often an English-speaking voice. Yeah, we can see that in conflicts that are going on right now, is that the people who are interviewed, the people who are big on social media, for example, who get to show their view of what's going on, tend to be English speaking because it's an international audience that needs to be convinced. They tend to be of, certain skin colors, they tend to be of certain backgrounds with certain representations of the reality that other people like. What we see also in terms of differences between countries is what we see here, is that countries that have more restrictive regimes often have users, people who are using technology, who are actually quite positive about what you could do with the technology, what the technology offers in terms of political participation. But what we see is that the most avid users of technologies in those countries tend to be the people who are better off, who tend to have good links with the people who are in power, and therefore it's not such a surprise that they think that the internet is great for political participation. So you get strange results in the data like this, where a country like Switzerland and New Zealand, we would think like, actually, why would New Zealanders or Swiss people worry about their online participation and how safe it is? It's because they are much more critical. They are much more, the people who participated represent a wider variety of voices there. This is not just, so this is kind of clearly has to do with who has had political power and civic participation power in the past. And it's also very much a social constructive thing in which certain people feel that their voices are not represented or heard. And that has to do with sometimes also the way in which technologies are designed to give prominence to certain people who are liked, or in discussion forums where certain people are literally silenced. There's good news in this field as well. What we can see is that young people and women who have acquired access and skills are much more likely, if they come from disadvantaged backgrounds, to participate online than they would be offline. But because there's a big difference between participation and their voices being heard, the difference between the advantage and the disadvantage is still quite large online. Right. So let me move to these new frontiers that are less studied. What we see is that, and this is an area in what we call in the field an area where there's a lot of moral panics. We might just remember the kind of all the discussions around Facebook and how Facebook was ruining young people's lives, young women in particular, becoming depressed and not feeling very confident about their bodies and things like that, and how that was somehow also embedded in the design of technology. So this book looks more at that kind of social technological side and how these things come together and be cumulative. So what we see in this graph is that, ironically, if you teach people technical skills, like the people who have social emotional problems, who come maybe from problematic family backgrounds where they don't have good relationships, who are isolated in a way, so vulnerable in that sense, or disadvantaged in that sense, if they acquire technical skills, what we see is that they tend to be most at risk of these kind of negative outcomes. They tend to disappear in the digital world, they seek validation. The validation is negative, but it's still kind of, kind of the only place where other people will pay attention to them, so they get dragged in. Well, with people who have better emotional and stable home situations, if these young people acquire skills, what they do is they tend to avoid those negative outcomes and still take up all the positive things that are also there online. So we need to think also about what kinds of skills we teach young people when we ask them to go online, because otherwise these inequalities between the advantage and the disadvantage might be amplified. And this is a clear graph of amplification where we see that these differences become larger. Now, this is the most important area for me, the area of consumption and the creation of content in terms of where we might see inequalities, because if we talk about the creation of content, and especially the everyday creation of content, it shapes not only our own experiences, but also what everybody else will see, right? If certain people create certain types of content, or if certain types of experiences are more represented in selfies or in clicks, so that certain websites become more prominent, that means that everybody who comes after us into that digital world will also be more likely to see those experiences and see those kinds of content. So it's not just for us ourselves, but also for the people who come after us and what that digital future would look like. And if we then really go to a different digital future, where it's much more about interacting with technology in the Internet of Things or virtual realities, right? This becomes even more important because there's a whole group of people who are early adopters of this technology who are feeding these kinds of devices with their data, their needs, their kind of, experiences of the world, and who are the kind of explorers of this wild west of virtual reality and digital technologies, that they are going to determine how these technologies will work for everybody who comes later and using that technology. And what we see there is that like the people who create content and consume traditional and other contents tend to come from the same parts of the world that have also historically created and consumed a lot of this content that is already out there. So, and this is just a picture of Europe, but we can see that the people who are, consuming and generating, therefore, because they're liking user-generated content, are also the kinds who are most prominent in terms of their experiences within, and who are better off, in a way, represent a certain types of reality and not others. So this is a very famous quote, and if we talk about it from the perspective of inequalities, so in the future everyone will be famous for 15 people, right? This kind of idea of the micro-influencer, well, that's not the actual reality of what's happening in many of our social media platforms. What we see in our social media platforms is that those who have already kind of a voice that is often heard, or experiences that are often heard, can represent a wide variety of their experiences, but that those experiences of the disadvantaged or the marginalized often don't find a place, or only a very kind of specific place. Like one of the examples I give in my book is that of the top YouTube influencers in the UK, only 7 of them are women, and women tend to be restricted to things like beauty blogs. Yeah, while the men can talk about sports and about the news and about beauty and fitness and health, but there's a certain representation. More problematically, perhaps, is that the experiences of marginalized groups who are discriminated or harassed, what they tend to do is what the data seems to suggest, but where more research is needed, they tend to retract into safe spaces, which are very important, But what that means is that they will still be exposed to kind of dominant or more kind of privileged experiences, but the people who have those privileged experiences are not going to be exposed anymore to the experience of the people who are retracting into those safe spaces. So when we talk about things like echo chambers and the inequality of echo chambers, ironically enough, what some of the research seems to be suggesting is that it's mainly the privileged who live in these echo chambers, because the underprivileged, they will still hear the experiences of other people. Yeah. So this is something that also means that the more privileged don't actually have access to that, or might not even realize that there's a different world out there. And this is where I'm going to finish. Because what we see now is that up until now, most of the interventions have focused, and perhaps rightly so, also because they have such a strong base in these historical inequalities, in improving the resources that have been unequally distributed based on sociocultural identities, individual well-being, and the home, or by having like national or international digital agendas that try to improve infrastructure and things like that. The other area where we see quite a lot of, so these are implemented in cities and neighborhoods. The other area where we've seen a lot of work is in the area of schools and workplaces where official certifications and curricula are established. However, one of the things that the book finishes with, and I think maybe some of the people who will comment on the book are going to be talking about this as well, is that actually where we see that really our practices and our interactions with technologies are shaped are in the kind of like everyday interactions, not just our everyday interactions that we have with the technology, but what we see other people do in our immediate environments. So individual interventions of teaching people individual skills does not make much difference if the people around you, or you live in a neighborhood or a network where digital is not appreciated, or where other people are not able to support you when you do that. So it's much less what I'm suggesting in the book, that we need to step away from some of this thinking about individual skills training, focusing on the individual. I think much more in this kind of ecological sense of how do we design spaces, social digital spaces, the spaces in which we actually live, because most of us, the majority of us, doesn't actually yet live as cyborgs in purely digital environments, right? We actually live here in these kinds of spaces, like this kind of classroom where I can see some people using mobile phones while I'm doing my talk, and other people are, just sitting there writing with a pen, right? So I'm going to learn about what is appropriate and who can do what with technologies by informal learning in these spaces, and that's where much more attention needs to be placed. So this is the end of my talk. And I know Mr. Chair has been very, very generous in giving me more time than the 15 minutes allocated. But I wanted to stop with this because this is kind of where, like, the kind of core points of the book. So in thinking and design, research and practice should really think about, you cannot just focus on one of these areas of inequalities. We need to be very aware of how everyday virtual, physical, and social environments shape how we behave in and think about how we can and should engage with these increasingly digital environments. But they also need to understand that it's not, just the people who are being left behind and have to kind of catch up, and that we need to focus on that, but it's actually all of us and what we do online that's going to shape how welcoming that digital environment is. And that there therefore needs to be a more collective kind of approach to understanding the problems, both the causes, but also what the collective consequences are of everybody using the technologies a certain way. So that means that none of us is off the hook, and that a positive digital future really starts with a browse or a click or a like in a network or a neighborhood, near us where we are present in, and that every one of us can do something. And that's, I guess, the realist optimist. The optimist part in me is that I think that we often are presented with the fact this is just the way the digital world works. We have no power over this. There's all these big tech companies that are designing this, but actually the tech companies are designing this for us and for the people that we live with. So on that more positive note, I think I will stop my talk and say thank you for giving me a bit more time than I was originally allocated.
Okay, thank you. I'm entirely sure who goes first. But let's start with Marta. I take it from Sao Paulo as first respondent. Thank you. The floor is yours.
So, good afternoon, everybody, I guess. I'm talking from Brazil, so I'm 3 hours behind. Thanks, Ellen, for the invitation to take part in this panel. I have been reading your work for some time and see this book as an excellent conclusion of a long-term and well-grounded research. I have to confess I'm still reading and processing it because it's a very comprehensive and sophisticated approach. So my congratulations, it's an excellent contribution. I'm not an expert on the field of digital inequalities, although I'm very much involved in the study of several dimensions of inequality. I conducted a very comprehensive study on the long-term path of inequality in Brazil, which ended up published by Springer, which is called Paths of Inequality in Brazil, a half century of changes, where it's a book where it's an edit book, where a collective project which covered a large period and several dimensions of inequality in Brazil. And after knowing Ellen's work a few years ago, I was very surprised by realizing that when I designed that project, digital inequality was not in my list of the key dimensions a researcher interested in inequality should look at. And this let's say, absence of digital inequalities in the project was not due to the absence of data. Indeed, Brazil is, as Ellen knows very well, Brazil is a rich data country on digital issues. We have plenty of data to explore digital inequalities in Brazil if we are interested in this research agenda, and digital inequality enters in our mental map. So that's one of the reasons I very much appreciate Ellen's contribution, because she not only introduced the digital dimension into my research agenda about inequality, but she also has been making a very important contribution by means of a theoretical approach, and also by advancing methodological strategies to make research on this. So thanks, Ellen. I think you've been making a very important contribution. This book is also very timely because COVID, let's say, the existence with COVID has drawn people's attention to the connection through the internet, because our societies turn out to be almost fully digital, and and more than that, digital inequalities became more visible than ever, although compliance with social isolation measures varied a lot across and within countries. Being connected became vital the last 2 years. So I think that Ellen's book will be very welcome, because she is providing some responses and some ways to look at a way of life where we are increasingly experiencing and understanding. Just to give you an example, which I mean is the most striking, Brazil during COVID adopted a very expansionary policy that paid 3/5 of the minimum wage to 68 million people, which is nearly 1/3 of the Brazilian population. in the inscription to this program was totally online. It means that those that were not able to connect were out of any income government support along these last 2 years. So it's a very clear example of the independent effect of the digital connection and the inequality of the digital connection on people's well-being. So I'd like to stress that this book is very welcome because she's providing answers and a theoretical approach to a number of questions people started to raise. I'd like to, I suspect I'm running out of my time. I'd like to invite Ellen to elaborate a little bit more, as she did not that in her brief presentation, about an argument she presents in the book, that inequalities in the digital world are multidimensional, sequential, compound, and interlaced. So barriers to engagement through the internet are superposed over individuals and may have cumulative effects. It means that, if I correctly understood, that isolated attributes of individuals are less important than their combination. I think this is a very promising argument that comes from studies of poverty inequality that argue that income alone is a very limited proxy of individuals' deprivation. And so we should look at a combination of factors to better understand, to better explore and grasp barriers individuals may find in their digital life and their access to well-being through the digital connection. So I'd like Ellen to elaborate a little bit more on this argument, which I understand is a very promising avenue and a superior approach to better understand digital inequalities. But I also know by other areas, by studying other areas of inequality, that the empirical study of intersectionality is not a trivial task. So I understand this is a very important let's say, point Ellen raises, and I would like to invite her to elaborate a little bit more about that in this event. And finally, I'd like to hear, Ellen, a little bit more about the normative reference. If you think, Ellen, it is possible to have for the empirical study of digital inequality, an empirical reference actually of digital inclusion. So as people have different digital needs and digital goals and in different skills and learning capacity, is it possible to set a reference through which we can observe progress societies as a whole can make toward digital inclusion? So is it possible to set some, let's say, empirical indicators through which we can observe progress societies can make toward let's say, higher levels of digital inclusion? So I stop right here. I'm afraid I ran out of my time, but I would like to finish congratulating Ellen once more by her contribution to this book.
Thank you, Marta. And we'll come back to replies from Ellen after. let's hear from Mike.
Thank you. And this is the first time I've been in a public auditorium for 2 years. It feels very strange. It's very interesting we talk about digital disconnects when we've had a face-to-face disconnect for so long. I should just say, I'm not an expert in media and communications. I'm a sociologist with interests in culture, so I do follow some of the debates around digital communication. But my overarching concern is to link those debates back to the social and economic inequalities which exist. So in my way, I see my work as running parallel to Ellen's work on the corresponding field model, which I've been aware of for a while. I think it really speaks in really interesting ways to the way sociologists, the best sociologists at least, to try and address these this divide as well. But I want to begin really just by saying, recognising this book as coming out of the contribution which Ellen's made to the International Inequalities Institute. And just for those of you not familiar with the IAI, this was set up by the LSE in 2015 because the feeling was that there were so many of us working at the London School of Economics who were interested in inequality, but we couldn't just do that in our departments. We have to find a mechanism to do that across departments and to pool our concerns together. And I was one of the first directors of the IAI for five years, seems a long time, and no longer a director. And I'm just aware that this has been such a fantastic learning experience for me, but it's dependent upon colleagues from different departments getting involved, and Ellen's just been fantastic in being involved in much of the work we do. And she mentioned the theme and the politics of inequality, which she convened with Amina Ishkanian. So, although a different discipline, lots of parallels with my work and with the work of the International Inequalities Institute. And I was very struck by the framing of the book, and also the comments Bart made at the beginning about the longer-term engagement with the debate about the digital divide. Because this seems to me to be one of the founding concerns of many researchers who are making inequality a central issue. We've had such a lot of policy concern about lifting people, lifting people out of poverty, getting more people to university, raising literacy rates, as if once people are lifted in this magical state of inclusion, and everything else is sort of be fine. And we've experienced this, economists write about this extensively, in terms of how do we raise people out of poverty. The Millennium Development Goals are very much about targets for lifting people in various ways. But the inequality researchers say, well, lifting people isn't enough, because lifting people also empowers people at the top to be more powerful and be more, cruel and unfair than they were before. So unless we look at the whole picture of the top and the bottom and the middle, we will have a very blinkered view by just focusing on the project of lifting people. Important as that is, it does matter to be lifting their poverty, to be sure, but it's not enough in and of itself to do that. And this is really, I think, where Ellen's book just hits the mark so powerfully, because what she shows in remarkable detail, I can't really believe the amount of scholarship in this book, but it's just that this model of amplification which she talks about, so that as we expand our digital investment in infrastructure, in mobile phones, in skills, yes, that is helping people, but it is also massively empowering the really powerful people even more, and that is therefore causing its own sorts of contradictions. So this is a really important point of congruence. Many researchers working on inequality across different fields of study. Three more focused comments from me, and then a couple of questions to finish off. So I'm really interested in kind of this argument of amplification and how digital communication and the scaling up of digital communication of various kinds may actually be empowering elites or powerful people more than the vast majority of people in society. And Ellen explores this in many ways. And Ellen talks about this Pareto question, which is about 20%, 80%, 20% of the winners. The way we think about this in sociology is this notion of the Matthew effect, which is that the more you have, the more you get. And you get this kind of disproportionate pulling apart of the extremes. I think it's really interesting in terms of making elites central to the way we think about society these days, because elites are very small in numbers. They show up in many surveys very much, but they're getting more disproportionate amounts of power. And I'm not aware of studies of media elites in quite the same way as there are studies of economic elites and political elites, but I think it's putting onto the agenda this sort of issue. And when you're talking about influencers and so forth, that's really relevant to that. I also was really interested, so I have an interest in Pierre Bourdieu's thinking about cultural capital, the notion that cultural resources of different kinds cannot be collapsed into economic resources. So you can't just say it's all to do with how much money you earn or how much wealth you've got, important that that is. It's also a matter of your cultural resources, your cultural capital. Bourdieu talks about your dispositions, your ability to master particular forms of activity. And I've been involved in a debate with other sociologists about, well, how helpful is Bourdieu's model of cultural capital now, given it was developed 50, 60 years ago in France, when very few people had a TV, let alone a digital, well, no one had a digital device at that point in time. And the old Bourdieusian model is really, cultural capital is steeped in the humanities. It's steeped in, liking, reading books, and going to plays, going to museums and art galleries, and listening to music live. Well, and that's still important, of course. But there's a massive transformation which Ellen has explored in detail in this book. I have argued, not all my co-sociologists agree with this, but I have argued that we need to have a different notion of cultural capital, which recognises the fact that digital skills or digital savviness, what do you want to call it, is itself a form of cultural capital, which contests more traditional humanities forms, and this very big age divide. And much of the sociological research I've done is explore that, and a few of us have coined this phrase emerging cultural capital to try and capture this new kind of cultural capital. So it's contested. I mean, I read Ellen's book as a really powerful and empirically works through example of how that is a maybe useful notion, and how we need to recognise that these digital skills cannot be collapsed into economic capital, but they do have very importance. And and for certain kinds of people, men, she brought that out as well as young people, they have particular relevance. Thirdly, I mean, another point I would bring out, which came out very much in the earlier comments, is the need for a global analysis. I think this is really exciting too with the work on inequality. That we can no longer just, here's the picture in the UK or France or South Africa. You've got to look at the global patterns, and some of the patterns you bring out here, mobile phones are now pretty much a universal thing in the world. So you think, oh, everyone is kind of connected, but of course, going back to this point about elites and the Matthew effect, doesn't stop the global north dominating in terms of the production of content and how these things are used. So I just think that's a really, really powerful example of the work you're doing. I was thinking about working with Milanovich on economics when he's looking at world economic inequality patterns. So really interesting parallels. I'm running out of time. So I just got two questions for Ellen, if she has time to answer them. I was really interested, and I really like the way you brought in the question of loneliness and engagement at the end of the book, in this discussion about the digital, and also how that was, that couldn't be mapped onto your economic position. It has different dynamics which are linked to digital connectiveness. Of course, that made me think of COVID, which isn't something you discussed in the book, but in a way, you've been in this kind of natural experiment for 2 years. We've had to rely, unnatural experiment, perhaps, this is a natural. You've had to rely on, life and Zoom and all these things for the last 2 years. And my anecdotal thought is very much that it has created a divide between people who feel confident with these devices and those who don't. And that, again, isn't a straightforward class divide or economic divide. It maps into other things too. Let's be interested, given you've laid out this very impressive framework, if you've got your thoughts about how COVID bears upon your arguments. And then the final point, which taps on something you were saying earlier on, I finished my own book on trying to put together some of my thoughts about inequality last year, published last year, called The Return of Inequality. And one of the things which struck me from the work I did in that book was how we need to relate to the rise of inequality, the rise of powerful elites and wealthy people, to intensify geopolitical conflicts. Because as those people become more powerful and influential, then they try and throw their weight around. And they try and, and not necessarily in a way which respects democratic norms and values. And, of course, we'll all be aware of the case study just experienced in recent months in Ukraine about that. And that made me also think about the way in which different forms of activity are linked into these geopolitical conflicts more and more. And arguably, we're seeing that with digital, the way the Chinese, control digital access, and then what's going on in terms of Facebook and so on being out of Russia. So one scenario would be that we have been in the current world where most forms of digital platforms like Google do get a lot of provenance throughout the world, but might be actually be moving, if inequality continues to increase, or the contradictions of inequality increase, might we actually be moving towards a world of more sequestration between different digital platforms? And if so, what can that lead to? Big question, I know, but we'll refer to that. Thank you. Thank you much, Ellen.
Thank you, man. I would like to bring in Mossberger from Arizona State University for our final spotlight. Thank you.
So greetings from Phoenix, Arizona, where it's still morning, but just barely. And I have to say, I really appreciated the insights from the previous commenters. And also, of course, I want to congratulate Professor Helsper on the publication of her new book. The Digital Disconnect is an impressive work. It's sweeping in its intellectual breadth and its scope. It combines years of research and theory on inequalities in digital skills and tangible outcomes, as well as disparities in access. And this is a highly readable narrative that's nevertheless theoretically informed and solidly evidence-based, summarizing the results of international projects, large-scale surveys, and interviews. It's grounded in Ellen's work in communities, listening to the experiences of those who are disconnected or less connected around the globe. So Ellen reminds us, importantly, that these are socio-digital inequalities inherently linked to economic and social disparities. They're created by them with consequences for these other inequalities. The key question then is whether or how technology makes inequality different, whether it results in amplification, stratification, normalization, or leapfrogging. And Ellen impressively examines the varied effects from these different areas, from economic inequalities and political participation to social connectedness and the ability to create. And she does this across different countries, moving from international trends to personal vignettes, reflecting differences in societies and cultures. And by making these comparisons, we can build better theories and more responsive policy solutions too. To me, though, one of the most important advances this book makes is to argue for considering how social structures help to shape the context and resources that individuals have for technology use. And she mentions the influence of communities and networks, and my co-authors and I have seen how important this is in our own work. In the US especially, there's substantial spatial inequality, not only between urban and rural areas, but also across cities and within them at the neighborhood level. My colleague Carolyn Tolbert and I have done research showing that nationally, poverty of place is a significant predictor of digital disadvantage, even when we control for individual level factors. And in our Chicago research, we show that living in a racially segregated area of concentrated poverty affects not only adoption, but barriers to internet use and what people do online. Using citywide surveys in Chicago, we were able to map the digital geography of poverty and racial segregation in the city and show how that matters for the barriers and activities controlling for other factors. There are whole neighborhoods with dramatically less online job search and health information, government services and information affecting daily life and opportunities in those neighborhoods. Ellen writes about the concept of structuration, the impact of social structures on technology use, but also the ability to change these structures too. In Chicago, the research we did evaluated a program in 9 neighborhoods. It was carried out by community-based organizations, affordable housing groups that had little history of technology programs, but had existing networks in the community to do outreach and training, to reach out to block clubs and churches and barber shops, school groups, and small businesses. It was integrated into other programs for neighborhood renewal, addressing other inequalities. And the idea was to build a culture of technology use in the community, leveraging the trust and relationships in local networks as part of more general efforts for neighborhood change. At the end of a 2-year period, these smart communities, as they were called, had significantly higher rates of internet use, home broadband adoption, but also internet use for job search, for health and mass transit compared to other Chicago neighborhoods. So it was clear the difference that technology was making in terms of the activities people engaged in more. This showed the potential that Ellen writes about to use communities and networks to bring about change. These gains weren't always sustained in neighborhoods. However, looking 5 years afterward, it was a short-term program limited to a few neighborhoods, and change is needed on a broader scale. But today there are renewed efforts and new possibilities. So reading The Digital Disconnect gave me a new way to think about Chicago's experience, to connect it to larger trends around the globe, and to think about solutions for the future. For all these reasons, this book makes an outstanding and powerful contribution to the field for theory and for practice. Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe give you the opportunity to respond to some of the questions and comments that were raised, and then we can open the floor for questions here. And I see there are already quite a few online.
Yeah. Let me start by reacting to, well, first of all, by saying thank you to Karen and Mike and Marta for these wonderful responses and, the effort to go through the book and point out what was useful as well for you from your respective fields. I think I'll respond to Marta's comment on the cumulative and sequential nature of inequalities by referring back to some of the things that Karen was saying about this approach that is more structuration or community-based. Because one of the problems when we study intersectionality is that we still often do it at this kind of higher level, right? We look at, yes, in my book, I talk about how it's cumulative, right? How often people who suffer one kind of disadvantage, whether it's social, economic, or social-cultural, also tend to be suffering other types of social digital disadvantages, and that therefore just solving one piece of the puzzle, just having a technical kind of intervention on access is not going to kind of overcome inequalities in digital societies, but it's the same thing if we just do an economic intervention without ignoring the digital part, right? So that kind of cumulative nature of both the social and economic and social cultural, as well as the different types of digital inequalities that we're talking about, makes this such a difficult problem to tackle, because there's not a one size fits all solution or a kind of one arm or aspect of inequality solution that is going to create a society with more equal participation. So where I talk about in the book, and that's why I finished the book in that way, is that the only way to do that is by focusing on where these are the communities and the lived reality of inequality and our confrontation and interaction with the digital takes place, which are communities, physical communities like neighborhoods or schools or churches where we go and we interact with other people and technologies, right? But they are also networks, and networks in this digital age are also online. And often a lot of these organizations that have been working with trying to create communities around positive engagement with society, whether it's digital or otherwise, they also have their kind of mirrors in that online space. And so I think if we try to tackle people who have cumulative disadvantages, to understand how these express themselves in this digital or social digital way, we need to go to where the people are and understand the lived reality of it. And the only way to do that is to really look at these physical spaces where people come together and the digital spaces in which people come together. And that's kind of, why projects like, or programs like the one that Karen is talking about, I think have the most advantage because, or most kind of success in this space. Because if we just look at accumulation as an individual with, let's say, come from a discriminated background in terms of ethnic minority status, for example, who is a woman who is socioeconomically disadvantaged as an isolated individual, it's really hard to see how they might overcome these inequalities in their everyday lives, because often overcoming inequalities or kind of being part of a world in which opportunities are offered depends on where you spend your life. It's very different. And Mike was referring to this. If you live in this kind of segregated digital world where everybody is like you with the same kind of levels of interest and skills, or a segregated physical world, like Karen was talking about, like segregated neighborhoods, if you, as an individual that might not have certain resources, live in a neighborhood where everybody is like you, it is very unlikely that you, as that individual, will be able to overcome those barriers. However, if you move around, if we are mobile, if we are interacting with others who can also support us and share those resources, which is a very Bourdieusian kind of approach, that would also mean that it's possible for not to level people up, but to create that collective responsibilities of people actually realizing a solidarity, let's say, was like there's somebody who doesn't have that same opportunity that I have, but I'm interacting with them. Or for the person who doesn't have this opportunity to see like, oh, I'm really being disadvantaged here, but not being able to engage in that way in that digital space. But that interaction is fundamental. And that same person living in that segregated digital or social physical space, if they would live in that more diverse kind of with more interaction and mobility space, the outcomes for them of digitization are going to be quite different. So to study intersectionality cannot be focused on the individual, but needs to focus, and as Crenshaw and other people who've talked about intersectionality, they talk actually about those everyday lived experiences. And for example, that being an ethnic minority woman is a very different story if you live in a neighborhood where everybody is of the same ethnicity and where women have a more disadvantaged position, and when you live in a neighborhood where maybe there's a lot of other women who do have kind of opportunities, right? So it's the lived reality that's important in terms of also the normative framework that Marta asked about, because it is a very normative debate, and we see that often in policy, that certain types of engagement with technologies are more valued than others. If we look at policies or what kind of outcomes people focus on, it's often economic. It's often about creating people who will be able to participate in a workspace that's good for the economy of a country. So let's teach people programming skills because the economy needs programmers, for example. So it's a little bit like factory work, right? We actually need a lot of people who can maintain and manage digital systems, not people who can critically create systems that might look slightly differently, right? So it is a normative framework in the sense of what is appropriate and proper use of technology by different types of people. But if we focus on these outcomes, if we think about the range of outcomes and the way in which the sociologists have actually thought about social inequality or exclusion, they say this economic, we can't have economic prosperity and equal participation that is good for everybody unless we also think about how these resources are distributed in terms of other types of well-being. And to understand how that works, we need to go have a more bottom-up approach. So we need to think about, okay, what are these other things that will make people live comfortable lives, feel that they belong in societies, that they are fully part of it and can collaborate with others that live in that same society to together create an environment that's better for everyone, that has to be done by kind of a different means, right, than what we're doing right now. So you can't do that by technical or economic interventions that are, again, focused on the individual. And you have to see, okay, what is it that particular communities or individuals need in their everyday lives, and how can the digital feed into that? And again, and I think, going back to kind of Mike's point about these geopolitical elites, the problem is that, these old powers that still don't exist. A lot of policymakers don't want to create a populace that is very critical and very creative and can create like a counter position to the way they want people to see participating in digital worlds. And while there was a lot of optimism about resistance and empowerment of the ordinary citizens, what we see is that actually the geopolitical movement, and Bart actually also knows quite a bit more about this than I do, is that especially powerful governments have gotten also more power over the digital world as it comes along because of these concentrations of these different resources. So this normative framework, as researchers, we can point out that there are other types of well-being that we need to take into consideration, and that we therefore also need to generate empirical data around these other types of well-being in these social and digital environments. Because if we don't, the emphasis is going to be on what serves kind of this powerful elite. And I think that's a little bit of an answer to your question. And then I'll finish to see if there's questions from other people who are watching. What with the COVID? Yeah, it's the big one. It's big, but the reason why COVID didn't figure in this book is that I was at my mom's house in quarantine trying to reduce the length of the book from 150,000 words to 100,000 words, and the pandemic had just started. So there was a massive headache for me to cut. But also at the same time thinking at that point, it's like, oh my gosh, what is going to happen? Because this is an elite kind of put into it's going to either disprove me completely, or it's going to show some of these patterns to even starker contrast. And so one of the things that has happened after I published the books, which actually been published a year ago, is that a lot of people have come and said, like, oh my gosh, what the pandemic has really shown is how different people's digital lives are, or abilities and experiences are of the digital world. And we talk about loneliness and participation. But one of the examples that I couldn't refer to in the book, but that's actually kind of come up over and over again as I'm discussing the book, is some of the subtle ways in which technologies are designed for particular cultural contexts and with particular affordances that furthers these kinds of inequalities in terms of the ability to participate. So for example, we are using Zoom here right now. One of the characteristics of Zoom is, if you're in a large group, is that the person who is talking is the one who is highlighted and will be visible. Yeah, the person who looks comfortable and is in a situation where they can turn their camera on is going to be the one that is literally put in the spotlight. They even call it a spotlight. That means that those people, and if you think about it in an educational context, for example, those people who are less confident in raising their voice, who might not be able to or wanting to show themselves and the situations and the lives they are living in, they are becoming literally invisible through design, right? And these are things that, in the beginning when we were scrambling to use whatever tools we had, we might not have been thinking about, but that now when I talk to educators, a lot of educators are realizing that in the classroom, it was much easier for them to engage with those young people who might be less confident or less comfortable. Yeah, that in some ways, that the ways that platforms are designed, but also the ways that we have started using them, kind of amplify some of these kinds of inequalities in participation. And that this is something that the other thing that COVID has done, and Marta referred to COVID as well, is that all of a sudden this debate about digital inequalities and who is and who is not in different ways online or able to engage with content has all of a sudden become part of all debates, debates around healthcare, debates about education, and not just amongst high-level policymakers or kind of, geeky academics who tend to think that this is important, but amongst teachers, amongst people who are confronted with this, like health practitioners, GPs, social workers. So I think the COVID has put this firmly on the agenda, but there's not enough understanding of this kind of context of using technologies in the way that they were designed and not questioning whether there can be a different design. So the awareness is there now, but I think that one of the things we need to do is create more knowledge or more understanding of how we can actually change that and kind of advocate for a change in technology. So COVID has made this awareness, has increased some of these inequalities where people feel a little powerless, because I think there's not enough understanding of where actually the room is for change and improvement and how we can collectively do that, because it's not going to be an individual teacher who's going to change this, right? It's going to be a teachers union, or it's going to be, the healthcare services or the GPs associations that are going to be able to do this, or human rights activists who are realizing that certain people are not heard, right? So that I think I would kind of say in relation to that. Yeah.
Yeah, and you answered also one of the questions, which was about COVID and the sort of differentiated levels of access. Can I kind of invite who has a question? I have a few here, but if somebody wants to go first in the audience, we have a roving mic.
Thank you, Professor. That was super interesting. You touched upon inequalities of participation, and I've been thinking about like participation parity when it comes to different digital societies in different like global contexts, and not being able to participate, even if there is access to technology, becomes a particular issue in the global south, in my country, India, for example. So my question is, how do we navigate? I mean, the answer to this may not be digital literacy, like you pointed out, and also Professor Mike pointed out. How do we navigate the subtler issue of agency? Because in India, like right now, I think 33% of women have access to mobile phones. So even if we increase that, it's not just about access, right? Like because inequalities can be held up by structural like institutes of patriarchy. So even if a woman is given access to a mobile phone, the person who ends up using it in that specific family would be the man. So she probably won't have access to the phone that she's given. So how do we navigate this issue? How do we move from digital literacy, issues of access, to address subtler questions around agency?
Thank you.
There's another question I can go jump straight in and answer that. So I think this is where it comes to, the solution is not always digital. Yeah. Because if we live in a society that's sexist or racist or ableist or any of those isms, then the technology is not going to solve that social cultural issue, right? If technologies are introduced into a system that's going to say, well, but women shouldn't be using technologies or shouldn't have an independent voice, then that technology, even if it gives you access to platforms, it's not going to do that, right? So this is where I say, kind of also in the point where I ended, this is where we don't go to tech companies to say how are we going to solve this problem, but we go to organizations that have been working to increase participation of women, in general, in life, in economic and social and cultural and civic ways. And but often they don't, like as Mike was describing, if was kind of, or actually Marta was describing, for sociologists who've been working for years on inequality or disadvantage and having people overcome this kind of they don't completely realize how the digital is feeding into that, how it's making some of these things even worse. And sometimes they are outshouted by tech companies. If you look at the education space in particular, I was just reviewing kind of World Bank data. And if you look at the companies who are now saying that they're guarantee access for all to education, it's tech companies. And you say, like, but what history do you have in creating educational content? And then like it's tech companies from the global north, from certain particular countries that go and create digital learning communities with digital learning content in the global south, right? Without an understanding of the local circumstance or condition, without connecting with organizations that actually have been looking at these, what are fundamentally social, cultural or socioeconomic issues in these particular regions. So that's also one of the reasons why I say you need to understand what are the particular processes that take place in the communities where these kind of circumstances happen. And then when you introduce technologies into that, you need to kind of make sure that you build the structures, because they can, if you introduce it in the right way, by creating, groups of empowerments or giving women spaces or voices where they are independently heard, then the technologies will also be taken up to do that. So the solution is not a technical one, which is not something that policymakers want to hear, by the way. They just want to know, give everybody a tablet and we'll be, social cultural issues are much more difficult to solve.
Yeah, there was also a comment online kind of emphasizing the importance of non-online capabilities, which is in line with what you say. Kind of before I go to you, I have another question here, linking off of that, because you mentioned tech companies. Somebody asked what would be the most impactful findings or advice you have for people working in tech companies in order to address these issues efficiently.
Yeah. Well, I would say multi-stakeholder collaboration, which is always a cop-out when you talk to policymakers and theories, right? Is that like we say, oh, we need to work across borders. But if you're a tech company and you want to go and work with young people who have been disadvantaged in terms of education, or if you're a big, or you're working with, economically deprived groups, then, and I've seen some colleagues here of some of the banks that I've actually done work with over the years, is that then you go and work with people who actually know how to deal with, like a kind of financial poverty and deprivation or lack of financial literacy, and how, you might work with tech companies to do that. And same thing for education, right? You might be able to design the platforms, but also I think, and this is interesting in the space of VR, there's a lot of discussions around ethics and inclusion, but they are often only held amongst technology people, right? They're not inviting people into that space who've thought for years and years and years about how ethics works, or how, social geographers have thought for years about how the design of physical spaces might actually make certain people more able to engage, And sometimes on purpose, cities and physical spaces are designed in such a way that keeps certain people out or not makes them use. And so we can see some of that happening, maybe not in as conscious a way online. So I think, try to find people who really know about the kind of issue that you're trying to solve with technology and work with them to understand how your technology might actually exacerbate things instead of improve them.
Please.
Yes, thanks very much. Can you hear me all right? Is this on? Yeah, I'm Liz. I'm a visiting fellow at the III, but I work in disability. So first I wanted to say it's great that the LSE has taken to having British Sign Language interpreters on your events, because of course that is about making digital content more inclusive, which is excellent. I really related to what you said about how there's been an excessive focus on skills development for individuals, and I certainly think in relation to the disability policy world, there's been masses of sort of, if we just teach people digital skills, they'll get jobs more and this sort of stuff, and it doesn't work. But I think it then moved from that to what can the tech companies do, particularly around accessibility. And, Microsoft has been saying there's over 1 billion disabled people in the world and they want to make sure everyone can be online. But I was interested in sort of who leapfrogs, because certainly in that world of people with disabilities, it seems to me some people become sort of tech geeks, and it's been transformative for a lot of disabled people, but only some people leapfrog, and some people might get the skills, and it might be that the technology is becoming more accessible, but still people are very much left behind. And I just wondered whether within the intersectional piece, whether you'd looked at all at those issues about the technical access for people with a whole range of different experiences of disability.
Yeah, no, and I think, it comes back to Marta's point as well, a little bit about that intersectionality and how complicated that is, and the disability space is so diverse within disability. Or when we talk about, in this digital space, we often I hear it slightly less now, but I used to hear it a lot. Well, it's a problem of old people, and what happens to old people is they will go away at a certain point as they get even older and then no longer are on this planet, right? So why are we worrying? Because all the young people, they are all digital natives and digital savvy, and we've written quite a bit with colleagues around that. But it's also true in the space of disability, where there's first of all a variety of disabilities, but also within people who have disabilities, there's actually a huge distinction between people who are disabled within families that have kind of a lot of economic resources and live in close-knit communities where they have support, where there's other people like them who can help them when they're stuck with the technology, right? So kind of understanding the diversity of that problem and understanding who gets to speak up, because in some of the work that I've done with charities, they call this the low-hanging fruit phenomenon, right? If you roll out programs on skills and say like, oh, come and learn how to use to learn programming or get access to a computer, the people who show up is people who are already kind of jumping to go, and the only thing they need is to overcome that small hurdle, right? But it's not that fruit at the high level, which you can't seduce to come to these things with cookie, biscuits, and tea, and and a good course that will teach you how to create robots. And that's actually the situation we're in now in many societies. I will give you an example of people who leapfrog, because it's something that's recently come out of some of the work we did with Latin America, where there's a contrast between how these patterns work between a country that's relatively equal in social economic terms and in terms of education in particular, where we see that in the Netherlands, which was where we did this work, partly the relationship between formal education and your ability to use the internet in terms of skills, all these variety of skills that I talked about after acquiring high quality access, is linear. The people who have higher levels of formal education are more likely to acquire skills, more likely to use it to get education, kind of all these things that we would expect based on these models that have been developed in a certain context. In Chile, however, what was really interesting is that people with, like, it was not a linear line, but it was a kind of a U curve, right? It's the people with the lowest level of formal education who have kind of probably, we're trying to find explanations, obviously, because it's slightly unexpected, and people with higher levels of formal education. Those two are the ones who, once given access and once having skills training, are actually able to get a lot of positive benefits from it. And one of the ideas behind it is that the people, like formal education is not as linked to problem solving abilities in an everyday level, right? It's that kind of, they actually, at a daily life, they have to be extremely creative to find solutions, to, do services. So once you get access and skills, you already have the ability to solve problems, to scramble and to figure it out, right? So that is our explanation for why in Chile, it's a kind of a smiley face, while in the Netherlands, it's like a stern, line upwards. So, and this is why this comparative work, I think also that Mike was referring to, is so important, because we can't assume that these patterns work the same in different contexts.
Thank you. I have one more question online, and we have 5 more minutes, so we'll get to yours. But it's a good question also from Brazil. What type of policy intervention do you think is nowadays effective to face poverty and to improve well-being in a digital society? Huge question. Short answer.
Read the book now. Yeah. I mean, I think, the one policy intervention doesn't exist. I mean, I think that's become clear from what I've been talking about. We need to really understand what kind of the actual barrier is for particular people in particular situations, right? So rolling out, something like the One Laptop per Child program that's been successful in Uruguay, in a whole country that's so diverse, where you have so many different circumstances as Brazil. Yeah, comparing Sao Paulo to, Brasilia, even, it makes almost no sense in terms of the different circumstances. So for me, a policy that takes into consideration the kind of local circumstances of, and the particular groups and needs of the individuals that live in those local communities. And that is, again, not something that policymakers want to hear, because that means that they actually need to know what's going on the ground, and that they can't roll out some national, one laptop fits all, or one digital intervention fits all program. So I think, yeah, that contextuality is really important.
Okay, thank you so much for your book. I think the topic is incredibly interesting, and we'll definitely go through it all. I'm a student of international development, so the whole inequality and the digital aspect of it is very important. My question is just relating to what you said about the digital platforms amplifying, as like when it comes to like protests and different movements, how they amplify the voices of people who already have a platform. So my question is, like, how does this fit into this whole modernization theory that sees the digital as like coordination goods that will then for like push development if like what the theory that you put forward in your book is that it's only a small group of people whose voices are being amplified?
Yeah. So again, there's a difference between, who within the movement gets amplified and who gets, whether people are able to participate who might not have been able to participate before. So I think, this is quite a big question. I mean, if we can solve that, but I think for me, it's more like in the book, I talk more about like, yes, it provides a platform definitely for certain people within movements, and for kind of this kind of modernization principle, providing resources so that you can leapfrog in a certain way to platforms outside of the more restrictive content where you might be deprived from a voice. But within the movements, if we look at who gets to speak within these movements, I think that's something that kind of that paradigm and that framework can't really deal with very well. And it's only when you start paying attention to who within these movements gets to represent the cause and the struggle that people are fighting for, that we really see where these inequalities kind of exist. And it's also because the international world wants to hear, when we hear about troubles in there's a reason why traditional media shows women and children, when you want to create sympathy for war areas and not, too many young men with Kalashnikovs who are also fighting for that cause, maybe. Yeah. So I think that's the kind of, again, building on more historical types of voices that we want to be listening to.
Can the subaltern speak?
Exactly, yeah. Which subaltern can speak?
Final comment?
Hi, Professor. We've met plenty of times before. I'm very interested in your research, and I just wanna ask two questions. They're about the same, but twofold.
I'll try to give one answer.
Right. I'm very interested in one of the main conclusions of your book, which is that it's important now for social digital inequalities research to focus more on network and neighborhood effects. I was also reading your recent book chapter in the Handbook of Digital Inequality. And I want to ask first, for countries like the Global South, where researchers like this have not been conducted at all, maybe even, would you say methodologically you should go in a sequence in studying first the social digital inequalities of the individual, and then from that, with that basis of data, you go on to studying the neighborhood and network situation, community situation? And second one is on methodological approach to the study. Then, I mean, you touched a little bit on that in this in the book chapter, but can you maybe explain a bit more on how, like, you mapping physical spaces and mapping networks in like a certain locale would like contribute to richer data?
Yeah.
Thanks.
I mean, I think, I don't, you have to also study inequalities in the kind of basic sense of access. Without access, without individuals having access, there's not going to be any digital equality, because there's fundamental principles. So that is important also in policy making and in studying to understand those fundamental underlying principles. But I think it's not a sequence. It's now we're going to do this first, study the first level, then the second level, because that's also not the digital world we live in anymore. There's it's much more complicated, much more content available. If you do it sequentially and design policy sequentially, it's constantly trying to catch up. So I'd say you would do it both. And also that in terms of methodologies, that means kind of a, more practically a multi-method approach. And that's kind of one of the things that with the neighborhood work also that Karen has been doing and that we've been working on with the mapping, is where you can actually see the difference between, you can study individuals through individual methods, whether it's interviews or surveys, where you actually get kind of this idea of how individuals from certain backgrounds, kind of what opportunities and abilities they have, and how it is influenced by kind of more broader policies. And you can combine that with studying how, when an individual moves between different environments, these opportunities or abilities might actually come out. So you can, and this is methodologically really difficult to follow individuals that are the same. It requires,
So it would be longitudinal.
Yeah, it would have to be longitudinal to really see, and that's the work that Karen does, and that we're actually also doing in Brazil with Marta, like looking at change over time. What comes first? Technological change, social change. What kinds of technological change are more effective in changing these environments that individuals live in with their characteristics?
Thank you very much, Ellen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike.